Welcome to part 3 of the Clash of Worlds. Now we're going to talk about North American nations. Now in North America, you're going to have some pretty significant nations develop there too. They may not be on the same population scale as the Inca or the Aztec empires, but they are still very relevant. For the sake of this survey class, though, we are kind of lumping them into two major categories. The Pueblo nations of the American Southwest and the Mississippi culture on the east, right? And that's really kind of a disservice. They are far more complex than that, but we just, for the sake of time, are going to just keep them in these major groups. The ancestral Pueblo come out of what we call the basket maker cultures, or what archaeologists call that, right? But they weren't the only group in the American Southwest to develop. They were just the only ones to persist, right? Other contemporary groups that existed during that time were the Mogollon, the Hohokam, the Patayan, and the Fremont, right? They all existed around the same time as the ancestral Pueblo did in the American Southwest. The difference is that ultimately the ancestral Pueblo will absorb all these or become the predominant and only one there, and these other ones will fade away. However, there are aspects of Mogollon and Hohokam life that will permeate over into ancestral Pueblo and the eventual Pueblo nations, right? For example, road building was a Mogollon thing, right, that will be adopted by the ancestral Pueblos. Complex irrigation, Hohokam were noted for very, very complex irrigations because they were predominantly in these areas around the Salton Gila River in modern southern Arizona, and you just had to develop that. And then finally, the ancestral Pueblo and these people will develop advanced astronomy. If you take a look at a lot of the ruins around these complexes and even just these irrigation systems they built, you can see alignments that go with not just the solar but the lunar cycles. For example, in 1977, on Fajita Butte in Chaco Canyon in northeastern New Mexico, a journalist actually discovered 3 pieces of sandstone lined up in such a fashion that when the sun shone through it, it projected on a petroglyph on the inside wall what they called a sun dagger. Now, it just so happened they were up there on June 28, 1977, just a few days after the solstice, and they thought it was pretty interesting that this sun dagger appeared to be really close to cutting right through the center of this spiral. So they began doing some research on it, and what they come to find, the sun dagger was not just a coincidence or a happenstance. It was a very complex astronomy tool. At the summer solstice, the dagger would project itself right in the center of the spiral. At the equinox, it would be halfway to the right of the spiral, and a minor spiral in the upper left corner would have a second dagger that went right through the center of it. And on the winter solstice, it would project 2 sun daggers that would bracket the spirals. But there was also a lunar alignment. The shadows cast by the moon happened to coincide with, on the edges of the spiral, with the lunar cycle itself. The moon is on an 18.6 lunar cycle where it varies 6 degrees off of the sun's trajectory. It's because of the Earth's wobble. And these guys had all picked up on all of this. So they were very advanced astronomers. East of the Mississippi River, the Native Americans there are going to develop in what we call Mississippi culture, right? And they are going to, as I mentioned before, their predecessors, the Adena, are going to develop the Eastern Agricultural Complex, where they're going to farm things like squash and pumpkins and sunflowers, and then eventually corn once it's introduced, right? But it's from this Mississippi culture that you get other crops like tobacco. Tobacco is kind of an interesting crop for them to be growing because it's not a sustenance crop. This means that these cultures are now growing enough excess food that they can even grow things that are for other purposes. And the tobacco is probably for religious and probably even commercial uses. Okay. From this, we get groups of people like the Algonquin people, which will cover much of the American Northeast. As a matter of fact, when we talk about Jamestown and the Powhatans are Algonquin ancestry. And then, of course, you also have the Iroquois, which is predominantly around New York State, but they'll extend their influence over much of the American Northeast as well. Now, the Mississippi culture was most notable for their mound building. These mounds that were built for varying purposes, including burials and religious purposes, will spread and be scattered and be found all across the American East. The most prominent of these, of course, was the complex known as Cahokia. Cahokia is located in modern-day Illinois, not too terribly far from the city of St. Louis, right? And it was a massive complex. It's believed at its peak in the 11th century that Cahokia had somewhere between 10 to 15,000 people living just in the complex itself. When you add in its little satellite communities, that's another maybe 20 to 30,000 more people. And so that means that you have a city that's so large that you're not going to have a North American city larger than Cahokia until New York will surpass numbers like that around 1750, right? At the center of the Grand Plaza stood the crown jewel of Cahokia, and that's called the Monk's Mound. The Monk's Mound actually gets its name from American explorers who were around the region after the Louisiana Purchase and found a bunch of French monks had set up a camp on top of this huge mound, right? All the material used to build the Monk's Mound was brought there from outside sources. It's very elaborately and detailed in its construction. Matter of fact, to put a monk mound together today, if we were to try to recreate this as a class project, it would require 40 million people to carry a 50-pound sack of dirt to build the mound. So we need to either have the class very big or we're going to have to carry a lot of dirt. In terms of its sheer size, the footprint of Cahokia's Monk's Mound is larger than the footprint for the Great Pyramid in Giza. The last thing I want to touch on before we get into first contact with the Europeans is the perception about Native Americans in general, right? When I ask students to close their eyes and tell me, what do you see when I say North American Native? And you typically get a response that resembles like what you see in this picture here, right? A Native American is nomadic. He's wearing suede outfits. He rides horses. He lives in teepees, right? The stereotypical Plains Indians. And this stereotype goes all the way back to Buffalo Bill's Wild West, to the spaghetti cowboy and Indian movies of the 1950s, to this 1970s ad campaign against littering, trying to say, hey, you know, be like this guy and don't litter, right? He's one with his world, right? He's one with the earth. And it just creates a lot of just incorrect impressions. The one thing about Native Americans, when we take a look at them, is that just how incredibly normal they are, how similar they are to Europeans and Asians and African nations. Like, for example, they fought wars against each other. From the moment they decided to identify themselves as national groups, if you will, right, they fought wars. There's a lot of evidence of this. For example, in the Pacific Northwest, the ancient cemeteries there, 21% of the bodies in those, on average, 21% of those bodies show signs of a violent death. Mississippi culture built palisades around their cities in order to protect them, right? Pretty much all the way across from the East Coast to the West Coast, from Mississippi culture to the Chumash in California, you have evidence of slavery being a common life way in these societies. Right? And then, of course, finally, environmentalism. One of the big things that gets pushed out there as far as perceptions goes is that Native Americans were these huge environmentalists. No, they were just very normal. They would do things that normal Europeans, Africans, Asians would do, right? For example, buffalo jumps. That's what they call them. They're actually bison, but they call these sites buffalo jump sites, right? The American bison is a very dangerous animal to hunt, right? So what did some of these Native Americans do? Well, you chase it off a cliff, falls to its death. A lot easier to hunt it after it's fallen to its death, right? So we have evidence of these jump sites all the way from Canada. There's a site called Head Smashed in Canada. I didn't name it. And to the bonfire shelter down in Texas near the Mexican border, right? This is a very wasteful way for hunting. You go down there, you butcher all you can, but the rest of it's left to rot. Ancestral pueblos often moved, and this was often caused by drought, but it was also caused by over-farming. They would farm the land to the point where it wouldn't grow things anymore, and so they would basically lay the land to waste and move on. Mississippi culture would do much of the same. Mississippi culture was known for clearing forests for farming by setting it on fire. They don't have big animals to move the stuff, so you just burn it all down. And inadvertently, you're adding nutrients to the soil. But at the end of the day, and the point is simply this, the Native Americans were just incredibly human.